Jingwinzi, good day, everybody. Welcome to Treaty Talks. Today, we're going to have a talk with Dana Tizya-Tramm. And before we get into it, I'm going to go over some items today in terms of who we are as Treaty Talks, announcements, and some housekeeping. So, as a reminder for some, and maybe new to you, Treaty Talks is a young adult initiative that facilitates treaty education in the Northwest Territories. And with some of the teach-ins we've been doing and that you'll see be happening is we've been taking a bit of a wider approach in terms of representation across Northern Turtle Island in the Yukon Territory, as well as Nunavut, and elsewhere. And so we are under Dene Nawa, which is a project of Makeway, and our co-creators are Peter Greenland, JC Firth Hagen, and myself, Marlisa Brown. Next, please. So some announcements. As mentioned in the last teach-in, we will have a website launching this summer of 2025. We also have Peter who will be doing some podcast work. This one is underway right now. And then we have more treaty teach-ins to come. So our last one that was with Marilyn Jensen last week is now up on YouTube. So you can access it there and share it with others. We can share in the link later on the handle that we have for our YouTube. Next, please. And then some housekeeping items. If you have a question, please put it in the chat. We will answer them as we go through Dana's presentation and at the end. We also have participant videos off, and this is because we are recording these sessions here. And we do want to acknowledge that we value, respect, and supporting one another as we navigate the treaty learnings. And this is most important because learning is vulnerable, and being able to share a space together to learn while we're all on different journeys is so important and integral in how we are in relationship to one another and supporting each other through these spaces as well. Next, please. And then we have some support lines here. So when it comes to talking about treaties and history and the current realities that we are faced with, these can be really tough conversations. And so we always want to encourage the use of using support lines or other supports that you have within your community or in your system of family and friends, and that also to take care of yourself too, whether it's during this session or if it's beyond. Of course, these things can come up at any time when it comes to processing the things that you've been learning or hearing about. Make sure to take care of yourself through breath work or going into ceremony, whether that's a sweat or smudging or going for a walk in the bush too. I always find for myself like how helpful it is to just walk out in the bush and just to be in that space to process things. Next, please. As always, we do want to say Masi Cho to the folks that are sponsoring us, which is Crown Indigenous Relations in Northern Affairs Canada, Dene Nawo, and Makeway Charitable Society. Next. And then, of course, before we get into our talk with Dana Tizya-Tramm, who is a former Vantak chief, I really wanted to share the last time that I had seen Dana, which was a number of years ago at the Land Claims Coalition, where I had seen him in the foyer just about to head out to do a presentation as one of the main presenters. And with him, he had his little baby. And for me, at the time, it was just like such a remarkable highlight because I had two little babies at the time at home, and he had traveled all the way from his home territory in the Yukon across Canada to Ottawa and had his little baby with him in this very professional space. And to me, it was like very validating to see that and be reminded of the importance of having young children and children in these spaces, and that these spaces are curated for children because they are, in a lot of Indigenous teachings, reminders to us about, the decisions we make and the impacts of where that will land, that we have to ensure that the people that it will most impact are also present there. And so I think in a way, it's a grounding way to have children in those spaces too. And I remember at the time as well, that when we were starting out treaty talks, for me, it was really important that I also had my children in those spaces. So in the last treaty teach-in series during the fall of 2021, I had my little baby with me during that time too. And I was like behind the scenes doing the tech support while I had my little boy there with us, just sort of sitting and absorbing to the different talks for that. And I just wanted to acknowledge this about you, Dana, because for me, I really think it speaks volumes to who you are as like an Indigenous leader, and just how motivating and validating it is to see you in these different spaces and holding those Indigenous values and teachings in the work that you do as well too. So I'll invite you now to introduce yourself, Dana, and to talk treaty to us. All right, JC, can you take the presentation down? Because Dana's gonna now put his presentation up.
Right, Choshita, uh, Vaji, Chijantalti, Oji, Yendu, Chitnili, Vandutquichin First Nation, uh, Haicho, Kigwadak, Vinigadachu Nithan. I said thank you very much, my partner. I really appreciate that. Um, and to continue and honor that, I'm bringing something back that, among our people that has not been practiced in a few generations, where the father within our people of the Vantakwichin in northern Yukon, the father would take the first name of the child regardless of gender. So my daughter was given the name Chichinsal from one of her elders, one of my elders. And so my name becomes Chichinsal T. So my old Gwich'in name is now put to sleep, and this one is the father of young eagle. So my daughter is now, this is her voice and her grandbaby's voice. It's no longer my voice. And I think that's what I really enjoy about our unique positioning and disposition and cultural or sociological technologies as Indigenous peoples, to really help make space within the world, make your space, that relationship structure between you and the world. Even now, my hair being cut is actually from a recent trip I took to Brazil, where I was shared prophecy and different aspects from our brothers and sisters down south, and signals a new phase in my life. So cutting off my hair there. So really appreciate being with each one of you here today. And we have a lot of information to go through very quickly. And so, kind of my own choosing and curation. But we'll go um, back to where a lot of things began happening for Indigenous rights in the Yukon, but also where we're going today. So my grandfather and grandmother are old Peter Tizya and Clara Linklater of Northern Coflats. My grandmother's mother was Catherine Natroop, who had married Linklater, Archie Linklater from the Orkney Islands. Um, those are my grandparents, my background. The first half of my family, my aunties and uncles, were born out in the Crow Flats. My mother was the first generation born outside as the youngest of 13. And so I was the first full out and also the first chief from like not born or within our traditional territories. Um, one of the youngest chiefs, now Time 100 up and coming leaders, Delta Management Clean Leader Awards. We took on the Trump administration. We did incredible renewable climate energy projects, and this is all just from, a kid from Riverdale. But let's take you on a journey on some of that. Okay, so I got to get the request to share. But in the meantime, I'll just start opening up that my parents also, I have a request in to share the screen. But my father, Dietmar Tramm, was first generation in Canada from Germany. Um, and he met my mother. But my father, his parents survived the Nazis. My grandmother, my Oma on the German side was half Jewish, so they saw that coming a mile away. And he was part of the negotiations. My family were part of all of this. Um, this is basically what I grew up on, so I hope everybody's able to see this.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to dive right into inquiries reports. This is the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry of the 70s and the Penner Report of the 80s. And we'll switch over to another presentation on the AI that I already have whipped up. This is a shot of the Chilkoot Trail in 1898 when about 30,000 people just showed up in the Yukon looking for gold. And it took news so long to travel back then. By the time all these people got there, the gold veins were staked up. That's why you had the first casinos, so much robbing and murdering and, a lot of the nefarious stuff that took place. A lot of young people died very far from home, chasing some dreams. Now, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, I think this is important because most of the agreements, if not all of them in Canada, even going to the Royal Proclamation, were about land, was about extraction, it was about building economies. That's what exists in Canada today. And when we talk about privilege, like what's, the privilege, and like, my cousin would say, even in Vancouver, he once heard a group of different people around a coffee pot. One of them was white, one of them was Middle Eastern, another one was from Asia. And they were saying, what about this reconciliation, this truth and reconciliation? Like, our home countries got invaded. What about us? Like, how far back does this go? And see, what people are misunderstanding is that privilege is very addressable, and that's what gets really important in our public representation. And, you know, Pierre Poilievre right now, his predecessor, Andrew Scheer, was I remember on the national news telling Indigenous peoples that what had happened in Canada was not a genocide. Where if you trace Andrew Scheer's Scottish heritage back 3 generations in Saskatchewan, they perfectly benefited from new draconian laws that were getting passed all the time from the Indian Act. And when the Indians of the day were starting to get their legs under them agriculturally and doing good, then new laws were passed that limited Indigenous people's access to the market and to the economy. And so Andrew Scheer's family really benefited from that. At at the basic, Canada, its existence and the people that came used the land, extracted materials, furs, resources, built an economy and systems off of that excluded Indigenous peoples. Their school systems, legal systems, all of that. So when we talk about privilege today, what we're talking about is using everything that you've gained from, everything that's benefited you and shut us out to start redirecting that energy. It's actually really quite simple. Um, and this is an example. In the early 70s, the Canadian government proposed constructing a natural gas pipeline through the Mackenzie Valley in the Northwest Territories, across the Yukon as well. And if you look at this area, it's just hundreds of lakes, hundreds and thousands of lakes. So I'll think wetland, which is some of the most important lands in the world, wetland. This area was rich in untapped resources, but also intersected with vast regions of indigenous land, Dene, Métis, Inuvialuit, and us in the Yukon as well, Gwich'in. And by the way, these you may see these go through in the future. There continues to be lobby groups for train through the Yukon to Alaska, all these different things. These kinds of tensions are never over. Community and legal tensions. This proposal triggered deep concerns among Indigenous communities that had not settled land claims and feared cultural and environmental destruction. I know myself, just thinking about the caribou, it becomes pretty clear pretty quick. Formation of the inquiry in 74 in response to the public pressure and legal opposition, the federal government established the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, appointed Justice Thomas Berger as the commissioner. Berger's task was unprecedented at this time, unprecedented, which is to listen to the people of the North and assess whether the pipeline should proceed. This is the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry. Now, this inquiry shows the importance of reports and what reports can do. And I've seen a lot of reports incite some pretty wicked movements with First Nations, like the successive Auditor General reports in the Yukon, where over a decade the Auditor General just sears the Yukon government in its inability to deliver education in a meaningful way. There's the so many reports, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but we have to ensure that these reports never just sit on shelves. And also, how can we get these into education systems and public education systems? So across 74 to 77, yep, someone has a hand raised.
Sorry, I just want to double check, Dana. Are you moving through the slides? Because I see we're still on the introduction.
Oh, no. Okay, thank you for popping up. Okay, there we go. That should fix it. All
Yes.
right, so um, Justice Berger traveled to 35 communities. He traveled to Old Crow. I've seen the photos of my community members, my elders today, when they were just like 19, like going to these meetings with tarps put up and up in Old Crow. But he held hearings across the region and recorded oral testimony from over 1,000 participants, including Indigenous elders, youth, and leaders. This book is amazing, and there's many other books like this, like The Land Still Speaks. Really incredible, powerful stuff. And the process emphasized respect for oral tradition and culturally informed consultation, a landmark approach at the time. Um, the main recommendation from the report is that no pipeline should be built through the northern Yukon at the present time, and a 10-year moratorium on construction, recommending land claims be settled first, that the North is a frontier but also a homeland. Berger emphasized that development without consent would violate the human rights and cultural integrity of Indigenous peoples. Environmental concerns. He warned of severe, irreversible damage to the environment and emphasized the spiritual and ecological connection of Indigenous peoples to the land, which is stated very unequivocally within this book, even at times them being told, or sorry, this was for the Penham report, but still they were told, you've now heard us speak. It's the opportunity is now up to you whether you act on this or whether you don't. I'll tell you, reading this today, a lot of this makes sense. We know that the pipeline did not go through, but how do you shift these types of notions into different sectors? This is the public sector of public and government and public courts, creating this inquiry. But how do you get these principles instituted within private corporations, for instance, because Indigenous peoples are not against development. It just has to be development within the land, within the context of the land, within greater principles, not just economic development for economic development's sake. It has to be woven into how an ecosystem actually works. That's something we're still dealing with today. So the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline really worked to stimulate a lot of people. A lot of people were coming out to meetings. A lot of people were now talking about their rights and about their treaties, these implications. The communities were abuzz. And this was just one of the events that made it to such a level. There was so much more, even in my own territory, them finding oil drums and actual uh, drawing of oil within the Crow Flats in like the 60s, early 60s, late 50s. So this is just representative at a much larger level of what we were already experiencing in our communities for years, centuries. Them even using them being the non-indigenous that were coming to our territories, using strychnine in the very early days before, like frontiership, before oil and gas or any of that kind of thing, even before gold, using strychnine. And we would come to these animal sites where everything would be dead. There'd be ravens, all these different kinds of animals. And our people would be getting sick in the springtime and summertime because of the melt off. So the Berger inquiry really legitimized this blueprint, if you will, externally for Indigenous consultation, but internally, it really served to create a lot of conversations and synergies. And at this time, you have Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow of 1973. So this had created a blueprint within the Indigenous social consciousness that was already well being enacted. But what this did was create more of a partnership, more of a language, more thinking with the federal government, with regional territories, etc. Because most of the things in the Yukon, and I would gather a good amount within the Northwest Territories as well, came from these Indigenous agreements. Um, the Yukon was basically just like a federal embassy before all of this began. When these conversations happened and during this time, so much money started flowing to the Yukon from Ottawa so that they could get the capacity to work with what was happening here, is what really created the economies. Universities through our agreements. A lot of Yukoners don't know this stuff. So the Pennant report is where we go further, and this is what really starts crystallizing this idea of modern treaties and operationalizing that within the social consciousness blueprints that we had mentioned with the Mackenzie Valley and Together Today. So in the early 80s, the Royal Commission, which they still have many reports, many reports that have been saying the same thing for decades and decades. The Royal Commission on Indian Self-Government establishment in Canada by Keith Penner, a member of Parliament. So in 83 is when the Penner report was released. And again, my parents were involved in the land claims. They were involved in the umbrella final agreement in the Yukon. When I was a kid growing up, like if we'd have these like backyard parties or whatever, barbecues, and there'd be like lawyers and you know the premier of the Yukon. It was just their life. And my father told me, which land use planning was one of the things that was his idea, and why I gave that background of him coming from Germany. He saw how the other parties representing Yukon and Canada were not really coming to the table in good faith, and so he knew there needed to be something to protect Indigenous rights before implementation. And that's where Chapter 11 land use planning really came from, that was admonished and protected even in the Supreme Court of Canada with the Peel watershed. But when the Penna report came out, my father said that's when it started using this language, self-government. And people all around the table started clicking. They said, that's what we're talking about. This thing that we're moving towards. And when the Penna report came out, that's what started articulating things for everybody. So it was released in 1983 and it recommended full self-government for Indigenous peoples in Canada. You can download this for free off Canada's federal government website. I'm getting goosebumps just referencing this thing and how what a tool it was in discussions and unlocking policy analysts, thinkers, and legislators, and everybody involved in this. Um, the Indigenous communities' distinct orders of government, and the report was one of the first major federal acknowledgments that colonial frameworks like the Indian Act are inappropriate for self-determination. Although never fully implemented, it did inspire and legitimize First Nation calls for self-governance, influencing future agreements like the Umbrella Final Agreement. Um, yeah, this is such a big legal quagmire. There's even some opinions out there that Canada would never abolish the Indian Act under current circumstances because it may take paramountcy over certain aspects of international declarations on human rights, etc. It says it takes paramountcy right in the act, and so to abolish the Indian Act would cost the governments billions upon billions of dollars to get everything up to human rights standards. Um, yeah, so that's what we have on the past. The Penna report, just like corduroy couches, we can't forget about them. Big thing in the 80s, and it really informed where we are today. And these are some of the stepping stones that went into articulating our agreements. The Umbrella Final Agreement being a canopy document in which subsequent self-government agreements were negotiated. 27 of these modern treaties, soon to be 28, in Canada today. But if you look into the history, each one of these came from development and they're still dealing with development today. And really quickly, before we head on to the next presentation, I wanted to say on that is working and looking inside the federal and territorial governments, even from international stages, look, they need our help. I mean, our environmental impact system in Canada is deeply flawed, and academics have shown with evidence that it's basically designed by industry, but the federal bureaucrats don't really know what to ask them in Ottawa. Basically, there's a lot of connections that need to be made, and I don't think well, I know that we don't have the same kind of timelines we do anymore. Back in the 80s and back in the 90s, when these were being discussed and we had talked about these types of things, there wasn't a big clock ticking over everybody's head like there is with our generation and global climate change and some of the other pressures that we're feeling. Yukon is now the number one death due to overdose jurisdiction in the world. These are realities that just simply weren't things that I necessarily signed up for. Artificial intelligence certainly being among some of them, and um, I'll rip through this as quick as possible. I want to leave time for questions. But the reason why I'm making such a quick transfer over is because I actually believe we're in the same place again. We're in another Mackenzie Valley pipeline inquiry around our data right now. And it's the same colonial practice. Nobody around the world is standing up for our digital rights, our data rights, except for Australia, where it's now illegal to have a social media account under the age of 16. We've seen reports that in the populace of the United States, suicide rates among young girls of 12 to 16 have gone up by over 70% with the introduction of Facebook. There is a whole new world upon us. But what does this mean for modern treaties in the era of data governance and artificial intelligence? Really quickly, if we're going to go over these things quickly, we have to ask, what is AI for? Now, we're being told that it's going to create efficiencies for the workplace, that it's going to, make our work easier and greater. But the question of what AI is for is different for the largest corporations to ever exist than it is for us, the public. They need data. They ran out of data. All the AI systems you're interacting with, you're training them. And for Indigenous peoples, however, the heart of AI really truly lies in the relationship between data sovereignty and AI, and this connection between data sovereignty, owning and having complete sovereignty over your own data, not some other corporation taking all of your data, and then that's what makes artificial intelligence real and something that's actionable and positive. Otherwise, it's just taking everything from you. This is fundamental in a relationship based on respect, relationship, and reciprocity. So AI is only as powerful as the data it learns from. So what is AI learning about us right now? What are our people putting into these systems that are eventually going to be used to create products for colonial governments? If you think about AI growing right now without indigenous data involved, it's going to supercharge colonialism and it's going to empower it. But we shouldn't also give it our data. The answer to a colonial AI system really only becomes an indigenous one and is a major opportunity for our people. So AI is only as powerful as the data it learns from, and indigenous nations that want to benefit from AI rather than be exploited by it means that they must own and govern and control their data. The relationship is so important because owning your data is how you own the AI. And owning AI will help you to own your future. It's really key because right now, if you don't own the infrastructure, imagine a newcomer watching how we trap and hunt, learning all of our techniques, and then one day they claim ownership over those methods, selling access to our own ways of life. This is exactly what is currently happening with all of our data and AI today. Corporations and governments are extracting our knowledge and feed it into AI models, and they're going to sell it back to us. This is our data, is our lands, and our future. And if you look at its implementation across the world right now, it's likened to techno-serfdomship, which is a term that describes a system where individuals or entire societies become economically and socially dependent on powerful technology companies, often without realizing the extent of their subjugation. It draws a parallel to medieval serfdom, where peasants were bound to the land and had little autonomy. And indicators of this are erosions of privacy. How much control do you think you have over your data? How do you think your data is monetized, analyzed, and commodified? A popular uh, example I use is Pokemon Go, which I don't know if anyone on here has played it or knows someone who has played it or knows about it, but it is one of the biggest games in the world, which was basically an internal think tank, and Google was trying to figure out a way to get customers into stores. And so they started, they released this and they put Pokemon near stores that people were searching, and so they were able to charge stores more for the service because they had an over 70% higher increase in being able to get people there. But what people didn't realize is you were also geocaching for them. So they were putting Pokemon in areas they needed data, and when you were pursuing, they'd be using your location data and your camera to be feeding their systems and their models, so they were getting all this world data. There's even one person in Old Crow who was playing that game. So Google literally has all this video feed and things like all around our community. It's incredible the amount of data that they have on you specifically, your whole family. You had 23andMe that just went bankrupt in Canada. Now a private organization is going to own DNA data. Like these are Chernobyl meltdowns of data issues. Like this is really, really, really bad, and it's not being talked about enough. Um, and another indicator of techno serfdom is a concentration of power, that a few tech elites amass enormous wealth while the majority remain economic dependents within the system. Think about Amazon, right? Reduced autonomy, AI-driven systems, and opaque algorithms manipulate choices, limit options, and shape behaviors in ways that undermine free will. This is already happening right now. There is a study out there that claims to have 19.2 million instances of Google affecting elections through a study where they take mirror people's screens, and so they can see what people are getting for their results in Google, and they can contrast against that with other users who are getting different results on the same thing that they punch in Google. So, for example, if you Google Senator Elizabeth Warren, who is calling for the breakup of Google, you're not going to find anything good on her. Why would Google want you to find anything good on her? And this is the fundamental problem. If you put something in your search bar, you're not looking for the worst of something. You're looking for the best of something. So it has to be biased. But then what happens if it's affecting our elections? If Google is choosing what we see on our algorithms based on what we're putting in on our search bar, what we're reading, this is already happening. And there are no laws around this. There's no legislative framework. Um, it's really not being talked about enough. So if we bring AI towards indigeneity, how can we unlock this and flip the script? Now, data sovereignty means that indigenous nations are to own their data under their own laws. This is the foundation for developing AI that serves indigenous needs like language revitalization, land protections, governance, ensuring AI indigenous worldviews rather than colonial interpretations exist out there, and preventing exploitation of indigenous knowledge. So the future, and to kind of end this whole trajectory here, the future is us being in control. And just like with modern treaties, would we allow outsiders to write our laws? Then why would we let AI trained by non-indigenous systems define our governance? The real unique aspect here is that this is already happening. And if you look at the rest of the world being stripped of their data rights and the centralization of authority and the undermining of communities, indigenous peoples are probably the most advanced and best positioned because of our modern treaties in the entire world, as not only having our sovereignty backed up by land rights constitutionally entrenched in Section 35, so it's not like the Maori or the indigenous peoples of Brazil, where Brazil doesn't have a constitution, so laws can be changed. We have a certainty much deeper than that. If indigenous peoples and Canadian indigenous peoples were to get control of infrastructure, whether that's, a powerful computer in a closet to maybe one the size of a room, which is probably bigger than they need. There are ways to do this without water cooling and renewably energized. But imagine what they will do for our modern treaties. And imagine a sovereign AI system for the community that's owned by the nation, that the elders and the community, it's part of the community meetings. And you're training this AI, an open source model on your own infrastructure with 100% data sovereignty. You're raising this AI like a child, and your organization teaches it about how it governs. And it'll get to a point where, or it can be today, this is possible, where you upload to a system, if you have data sovereignty, if it's not connected to a major corporation, and you have your own sovereign system, you can feed it your governing, your authorizing, and strategic documents. And then it can begin outlining the type of data that it would require to start um, supporting your community and your nation. And basically, I foresee in the very, very near future, our people understanding and utilizing this technology and bending modern society through the power of AI and its translation of our principles into modern society. And it can become a two-way system where we're providing different types of corporations in corporations, how to manage them and their corporate charters, how it's a tool, remunerative and sustainable economies. This is how we can take our ways, translate them to guide modern society. And if you do this at scale with 634 nations in Canada, we can reinvent this country from the inside out in a good way without throwing a single Molotov cocktail or without sailing a single F the Prime Minister flag. This is how powerful this technology is, and it's already here. We have been working for so long, for so hard throughout this journey. I think it's completely unfair as a generation to now look at these lands coming as a generation born under these modern treaties, ready to enjoy them. But instead, we have to go right back to Parliament and right back to the Congress because of climate change. If this is not a solution, I'm not saying the solution, but our people are so in, ingenuitive, intelligent, intrepid. We used everything, even humor, as a tool of survival where we thrived out in these lands. We have to get to a place personally and as communities and as a nation, we have to create this relationship with this very awkward technology that nobody asked for. Nobody asked for this relationship or this technology, but it's here. And I think that I know that when our people learn how to ride this bike, when we know how to make this work for us, that we will, I think, finally come to a place and a chapter in these agreements we had always envisioned and hoped for, and within some responsible timelines. So I really appreciate your time and want to leave some time for questions if there was any as well. Merci.
Wow, Dana, Masi Cho. This was so powerful, eye-opening. The wheels in my brain are just turning. Oh my gosh. Masi Cho. It was amazing. You gave us so much in 45 minutes, and we're so excited and grateful to have you on here. We'll open up some questions on the floor as well. Peter Greenland wrote, "This reminds me of the conversation in the language change of traditional knowledge versus indigenous knowledge, trying to formulate questions around that." Oh, that was towards me, wasn't in the chat. That's a very good point, though. And just the way you opened up as well was super beautiful. Your traditional introduction, who you are, your family, taking the name of your daughter and which in traditional teachings, talking about the Mackenzie Valley pipeline inquiry, the Penner report. I did not know about the Penner report and about AI and the work that you do. Something that's really on my mind as well is, what do you envision for working with AI for data sovereignty? I know you've been talking about it, but it's hard for me to like envision it. What does that mean? I know like a little bit of about AI, but I don't know a whole lot. Just mostly like all the online climate change, all this unauthorized use of our data just being on social media. Before I
Yeah,
go
no,
on, I'll stop.
no, that's the perfect question and something I didn't address in this as well because we had to go so quickly so far. But data sovereignty could be as simple as having an encrypted section on your hard drive on the laptop that I'm speaking to you with, right? Now, why your nations don't have data sovereignty now is that if you're working within another corporation's environment, like Microsoft or Google, like you have to apply to the terms of service, and there are certain thresholds there, right? You don't have your own systems. Basically, if there's a construction contract going out for a house and it's in the Yukon and it's for this wicked money, it's a great job, build this house. You have someone who came from Old Crow who had to borrow tools, doesn't have access to a lumber yard, what are their opportunities there? Then you have a kid in Whitehorse who grew up right by a home hardware. Who's going to get that job? So basically, um, around AI and around technology, it's the same thing. If we don't own these systems, if we don't have technology, we're just going to get left behind by everything. And AI is owning that system. And that system could be really simply a closet filled with GPUs, which process calculations because AI requires calculations in which to do its work. And that's where the energy consumption comes from. Because large language models, what AI is based off of, which we understand how it works, but not we don't have the roadmaps. It creates relationships between letters and words. So anything you're typing in, the AI is going across everything it's learned in the past. And it's like, these are these relationships. It takes way more calculations than a search bar in Google. AI is not to be used as a calculator or not as a search bar. It's a large language model. And it's just the beginning of this technology, which requires a lot of computer chips to run on. So if you're using an AI system on the internet that's not on your computer, that's in the cloud, you do not own that data, and it's creating a need for a lot of electricity and a lot of computation. If you wanted to solve for that, your nation, let's say there's not going to be many people using it. Let's say that this super powerful AI is just for council. Then you could get one closet, fill that with GPUs, get a solar panel and a little wind turbine on the roof to offset its carbon and to power it. And then you'd have your little system that you could run that on, and you have all the data sovereignty because you have it physically. But if you attach it to the cloud and then to the internet, then you're probably going to lose your sovereignty unless it's encrypted well. So sovereignty is just really basically having that full decision power over your data. So if you think about what Ford Motor Vehicle has on you, what Instagram has on you, what Facebook has on you, um, that's what we're talking about, is that any interaction with any of these systems, if you're not paying for it, that's because you're the product. You're being sold. So everything you're doing on Instagram, everything that you're doing on these apps are powering their systems, are giving them money when you're doing the work. It's like Pokemon Go, right? People are searching around for these animals, and you're actually doing the geocaching for Google. You're giving them the pictures. You're connecting these things. So really, if Indigenous peoples, and especially with our modern treaties, let's say we went further, and instead of just having a closet of computers, let's say they had a whole CCAN that could support 1,000 people, and then with this AI, because you own the CCAN, you own the computers. AI is open source coding. You could have it within the CCAN and then give it all of our modern treaties. And in fact, why not all the modern treaties across Canada and then all of Canada's laws? Put all of that in there and then start giving it access to your past negotiators, your elders on the agreements, on all of that. And then all of a sudden, you really start cooking. And remember, nobody else can access this, right? It's on your data center, whether that data center is small and in a closet or as big as a sea can. But you own that infrastructure. That's what changes the game. Even if the rest of the world shut down, you could still have your AI system going because you have everything you need to support it, the electricity, the computer chips, la la la. Now what happens is you get something outside of ChatGPT that gives you very strategic analysis on the information and data you feed it. This is going to revolutionize education systems when our AI systems will begin educating on anything that you type in, from an elder asking it, what's this governance act that they're talking about at a GA, to just youth. AI is going to restructure everything. And I think that Indigenous peoples and our communities are the best positioned to take this technology and show the world a proper usage of it, not just putting it into a fridge and putting it into a car for the sake of doing it. Um, really quickly, how could you explain how modern AI use could be described as indigenous knowledge, and how much would it be cost to build the system infrastructure? If you want to know costs, send me an email. I'll put that in the chat because we have all of that down. That's what we do. But I really appreciate this question about indigenous knowledge, and I'll go through this really quickly. I've done like years of work on this. And if you really break things down, think about the ribonucleic acids and all of the amino acids that make up your DNA, your RNA, the creature that you are. It found a way to basically get better from information, not worse. If you use AI to create AI, it ends up devolving and turning into nonsense. But our DNA did the opposite. It gets better through information and it builds and it learns from it. So if you look at all of the information that it's gathered through evolution and then us to the human being, where we have hundreds of muscles dedicated to speech like no other animal. Um, and when we started talking, and creating a language, that was a data system external to our internal system. There was things like a great flood or an ice age that informed our DNA, but the words and the data we started creating externally, that's a form of data too. That began a feedback loop of inference on our DNA when the stories that we told and a language that we created allowed us to educate one another and make us better at hunting, better at relationships, better at community. Basically, that was the first AI system, was our traditional stories and our oral histories and the way that we created an information system based outside of all of us that was an external reservoir of knowledge that has been informed by hundreds of thousands of people over space and time that we had access to through a supersymmetry of teachings, through our stories that used heavy and analogy and metaphor, but also down to the minutiae in how to exact frames of traditional knowledge or how to derive teachings from the land in this life today. Basically, that's what we're doing here right now. The way that we've approached AI has been fundamentally from an indigenous place and a traditional place. So when we go to these places and we don't know anything, while the rest of the world is scared and they don't know what to do or think, we have those teachings as indigenous peoples of what to do, how to meet someone in transparency, with song, to make yourself known, those intentions, set boundaries on the relationship, are actually, I think that, yeah, in every way, shape, and form, that AI can be utilized by indigenous peoples and create new avenues, because I think we understand one thing the best. And of all my conversations across from coast to coast to coast in Canada, what I'm starting to really understand about the emotional impact of AI and where I think Indigenous people are so best poised in this technology is a lot of people are scared or they don't trust AI in general. And I think what people are really doing is they're conflating their identity and their purpose with their roles. Because we have these roles in life, right? We have these jobs, we have these whatever. I think Indigenous peoples will be masters at identifying how AI will augment our roles, but give us more time to explore our purpose and identity as a community. Go ahead and augment the role, but AI will never be for our purpose or our identity. Our people have always had that. So, yeah, appreciate that, Masi.
Hi, Cho. Always nice to see you, Dana. Always a big